of course, you can include Singapore if you want to, if you're comfortable.
Sure.
The future of what's happening next. So, yeah. Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice. I'm Robin Stienberg. Here at Save Hyatt column, I'm here with Dr. Darren Zook from the University of California, Berkeley, who is visiting here in Singapore for the Singapore Management University. And he's going to share with us what's happening in Southeast Asia and the future of Southeast Asia's politics and the business. Dr. Darren Zook, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, please tell us what's happening in Southeast Asia. Could you just give us a brief overview?
Brief overview, okay.
It could be detailed as well.
Brief plus detailed. There's a lot of exciting things happening here, and there's when I say exciting, I know they can be destabilizing for some people, but I'll call them exciting. One of the things that's happened probably in the last 5 or 6 years, Southeast Asia in particular used to be characterized, you had Singapore, which was by far the most dominant economy, followed by Malaysia and a few other countries. Well, that space between Singapore's dominance and the other economies of Southeast Asia is slowly shrinking. I think it's a good thing. It improves competition, but of course it's a new position for Singapore to be in. You have to kind of fight to be number one as opposed to just easily getting that ranking. Again, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good and healthy competition economically within Southeast Asia, and ultimately it will bring ASEAN closer together. In terms of politics, there are some things to look for on the horizon. I'll start with what will probably be the most important elections in Malaysia's history since 1957. The ruling party in Malaysia, UMNO, Malaysian National Organization, has been in power since 1957, leading the Barisan Nasional, the ruling coalition, for instance. For the first time since 1957, there's a real possibility of an opposition party either taking power, opposition member, especially Anwar Ibrahim, coming to power as prime minister. And even if that doesn't happen, even if UMNO manages to stay in power, it's going to face by far its most credible threat that people in Malaysia want something different. For decades, it is the government has always said, don't vote for what we don't know because it's all about stability. But for the first time, people are saying, well, but maybe voting for something different, there's nothing wrong with that. So this has a lot of people trying to figure out what's going to happen in Malaysia. Because Malaysia being the second most dominant economy, for instance, in the region, the question is, what would a more vibrant democracy do for that? Would it destabilize Malaysia's economy, or would it open it up? One of the states, for instance, in Malaysia that is run by the opposition is Penang. And Penang couldn't be happier. I was just in Penang a few months ago, and when I talk with people there, Penang has a lot of high-tech industry there. They'll say, it's been great for us because having the opposition in charge, we can think more freely, we're not beholden to anything, we are just developing as quickly as we can. And the question is, would that happen in the rest of Malaysia, or is Penang just unique? So the next big event is going to be watching the elections in Malaysia. Very exciting time for Malaysia. We were talking earlier, of course, about Burma. That's going to be another thing to watch, whether the democratic transition in Burma is going to continue to go, and what can Southeast Asia do to further that along. That's one thing to look for. In Thailand, also a very rapidly growing economy there. The next big transition for Thai politics is going to be, and this is a very uncomfortable thing for people in Thailand to talk about, which is going to be what happens when the current king withdraws from the picture. Because Thai politics, especially since about 2006, has been somewhat volatile. Current Prime Minister, Yingluck Shinawatra, sister of Thaksin Shinawatra, has at least done a good job of trying to maintain stability, something that no one before her since 2006 has been able to do. But there are many people who argue that the only reason it works, you have the red shirts and the yellow shirts fighting each other in the streets sometimes, the only reason it works is because they have a king that is kind of a moral anchor of the whole system. There are many people who are very afraid that if the king is removed as a moral anchor, either because he's incapacitated or he passes on, no one in Thailand likes to even think about this, but it's just a reality, is if the moral anchor leaves the system, what's that going to do for Thai democracy? Will it find its own moral anchor and then develop as a very stable democracy? Or will it become kind of a free-for-all between red shirts and yellow shirts to see who can win, because your kind of moral force that was keeping you from devolving into civil war is now gone? That's something to look for. That's going to be, something within the next few years that Thailand has to deal with. Philippines, for instance, Noynoy Aquino, current president in the Philippines, is trying as much as he can to tackle the issues of corruption, which the Philippines has a problem with, to build a national economy, to deal with the issue in the Deep South. There's been an ongoing political issue with the several Muslim groups in the Deep South. He has a very, very huge plate of problems he has to deal with, but probably more so than anyone who's been in power since Fidel Ramos back in the 1990s, Noynoy Aquino has the talent and the moral support from the people of the Philippines to at least start trying to do that. So there'll be a lot of attention on whether or not he can do this. If he can even start the process, the Philippines might suddenly be back on the map. If it goes back to business as usual, you'll start seeing a lot of people in the Philippines become very disillusioned with democracy, and that may create problems further down the line. Going around the map a little further, let's see. Indonesia? Is this okay? I'll just keep going around.
Yeah. Indonesia.
Indonesia's biggest problem is actually the security problem. Their economy has always been strong. They have oil. They do have corruption, of course. The President SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, is, if nothing else, a very stable force in politics. But more so than any other country in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is a place that does have to deal with radicalized groups. And that's a problem both for Indonesia itself, and it's a problem for whether or not those radicalized groups, if they are not dealt with effectively, whether they can spread throughout Southeast Asia. So if you're thinking of security and politics in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is probably the most important country to watch.
And what's happening in Brunei? Doesn't Brunei bother about these things with what's going on with Indonesia and their neighbors?
Brunei is a unique country, and politically, people say, what's happening in Brunei? The answer is not much. But it's not because there are no politics. It's just it's run as a sultanate. And even though there are large populations of, say, non-Muslims there who are working in the economy, the way citizenship rules are set up in Brunei, you have to be, in essence, part of the Islamic kingdom to be a citizen, and the rules are pretty strict. And as long as the economy is functioning, which it is, it's just there.
And I think, correct me if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
It seems to me that Brunei is the only Southeast Asian ASEAN country that doesn't have any free elections.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a democracy. It's run as a sultanate. It's not a democracy, and you couldn't even put enough pressure on it to encourage it to change into a democracy. And that's it's the great anomaly, because it's really just kind of a small country, wealthy but small, and because it doesn't really threaten any of its neighbors, it's just kind of there. So whether I will say this, there have been some reforms. So that the Sultan's family, and this happens when you have a lot of money. Some of the crown princes and the princes have been, let's just say, they've overspent their credit cards, as hard as that is to believe. And there have been a couple of times when the Sultan has punished them for it. It's like, this is, you should not be buying this many private jets or something like this. And so even in Brunei, there is a sense of propriety. And even though the royal family, for instance, is very, very wealthy, and it's all oil money, that they don't want to be seen as, kind of a Muammar Gaddafi style Libya, where it's just the royal family has nothing but all of its power, it spends and doesn't care about the people. And the fact is, the Sultan does rule. There's lots of money. It's run as a private sultanate, basically, but the money is, at the end of the day, sunk back into the economy. Mm-hmm. So you don't have those kinds of, the royal family is wealthy, but there are poor people in the streets, and there are refugees flowing into Malaysia, because you don't have those kinds of security threats coming out of Brunei. There's been no real reason to put it on anyone else's political radar. It just kind of sits there, earns money, and it's stable, and that's the end of the story.
What's happening over in Vietnam and Laos? are they reacting to the issues with Thailand and as well as Myanmar?
Sure. Vietnam and Laos are, Vietnam even more so. Vietnam is kind of on the cusp of just really transforming into an economic powerhouse. In fact, you may see, China is struggling with issues of rising wages. And you may see companies starting to pull out of China and investing in Vietnam. And personally, I think that's a wise investment. Yes, Vietnam does have some problems with corruption, but it's aware of them and it's trying to get them under control. It's a good time to look at Vietnam. Laos is the same. Laos's economy is not nearly as developed as Vietnam's is, but Laos is is kind of pursuing the same path. And it's an interesting take on what we saw in China. China always had this idea that the Communist parties in power will liberalize the economy but not a political system. But there's something very different when you're in Vietnam or Laos. When you're in China, for instance, you're always aware that the state is still very much in charge of things. You don't have to go very far to do something out of the ordinary before you realize someone has figured out what you're doing. You don't see this in Vietnam. It's very interesting. Even if you look at the artistic scene, there are artists who get away with making all sorts of, used to be art had to work for the state. That's the whole Communist Party line. Now you have this vibrant art scene in places like Hanoi. And the Communist Party seems to be withdrawing from that kind of public life a lot more than is the case in China. And as a result, people in both Laos and in Vietnam, there's a sense of freedom. I would call it almost like a personal sense of freedom in the air that you don't see in China, and it translates into lots of creativity, lots of economic creativity and other forms of creativity. So you get a very, very different feel, and I think if they're able to pursue their own individualistic paths of countries that are, on paper, run by one-party states, run by the Communist Party, but, I've been in Laos and Vietnam in the last 2 months, and at no point was there, that state presence. Of course I didn't break the law or anything, but I wasn't trying to. But the idea was, you really felt like you were just interacting in any other country. The presence of the party or the presence of the government as a regulatory force wasn't there. And it's a very refreshing feeling. So I think they're doing something that it started as a package of economic reforms that was like China, but has now become something very different. So I see both of them potentially strengthening their economies greatly. Vietnam has resources that Laos doesn't have. Lao coffee is there. Laos makes actually a really great beer that they're trying to find ways to export, and that's, given the fact that, tiger beer is such a prominent thing. I mean, creating a beer that is for global export can actually can generate a lot of money, and if that money is then invested back in the economy, you may see Laos emerge as one of the more dominant economies in Southeast Asia too.
And so is casinos. I heard that.
Casinos. I'm not sure.
Laos has been building new casinos over there.
That's true, and I'm not sure the casino approach to wealth is the best approach, especially if it expands too rapidly because it's open for corruption. But if done wisely, it could succeed.
What is the perspective for Japan and Taiwan towards China? I mean, what's going to be the future like for the Japanese and the Taiwanese economies?
I mean, Taiwan's economy has always been amazingly strong for the size of its island. And one of the things that, of course, mainland China has been trying to do is they've been trying to strengthen all the cross-strait investment. Largely, the political project is that if they can take Taiwan's economy and pretty much just intertwine it with China's economy in a way that they become inextricable, then Taiwan's independence becomes almost impossible. Of course, people in Taiwan are aware of this, and so there's all sorts of divisions within Taiwan about how much should we invest in China, or at what point is it too much. Japan has one thing working against it more than anything in regional politics, and that is an image problem. Japan's economy, even in its downturns, is still a very strong economy. But one of the things that Japan continually has to deal with, and this is in relation between Japan and South Korea, Japan and North Korea, and of course Japan and China, is overcoming its past. There's just a lot of resentment about the wartime past that Japan, of course, wants to move beyond, but China and especially South Korea frequently come back to. I'll give you an example of that. So there's been all sorts of talk of reform at the United Nations, institutional reform. One of the things that has come up is the possibility of expanding the number of permanent seats on the Security Council. Right now there are only 5 permanent seats, what they call the P5, the permanent 5 members. France, the UK, Russia, China, and the US. The idea was maybe we could open up for 6 or 7, or some people have said as many as 10. Well, one of the first countries that was discussed as a possible member, new permanent member, was Japan. And the idea was that Japan would be a good choice because its power is measured in terms of economic power as opposed to military power. Right now, all the permanent members of the Security Council are military powers. That's why they're on there. And the idea would be, well, if we choose Japan, that's sending a message to the rest of the world that military power is not the only path to pursue to become a great power. You can do it economically. But when that came up, when Japan was saying, yeah, that would be great, would be on the Security Council, China, South Korea immediately, no way. Not until Japan acknowledges the past and these types of things, and that creates all these tensions that really prevents that part of Asia from becoming a true regional bloc. Southeast Asia has ASEAN, and it works reasonably well. You don't have anything like that in terms of cooperation between North-South Korea, or if you take North Korea out, between South Korea, Japan, and China. This issue just never goes away. The competition between them is very fierce, and they'll cooperate, but it just doesn't work like a regional organization could.
And speaking about North Korea, they have been very, conservative these days. We have not seen the new leader being as outspoken as he should be.
Yeah.
What's happening in North Korea? What's your perspective?
The fact that Kim Jong-un, the new leader, is not as outspoken as he should be usually signals that he is not as firmly in power yet as either he wants to be or other people want him to be in the country. Usually in these kinds of transitions, there's always a power struggle of some sort. There even was between Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il. That was a little bit easier because Kim Il-sung was able to firmly put Kim Jong-il in power before he died in 1994, so that when the transition happened, the struggles were minor. They were still there. There were people that didn't like Kim Jong-il, but the fact was, it was like, you're going to accept this, and if you don't accept this, you'll be exiled away. Kim Jong-il didn't have the time to do that. He became ill, had a stroke, became ill, and did not quite have the time to work the transition through as his father did. Kim Jong-un was not the first choice either. So it's a harder sell to have this young, inexperienced leader move into the position of leadership and control everything. There's obviously going to be various different factions who are going to say, this guy's not ready to rule, somebody else should rule in his favor. So people started kind of jockeying for positions. Kim Jong-un has been seen in public. He's made a couple of pronouncements. The most significant thing is that Kim Jong-il's brother-in-law has backed him. He's probably the most powerful person in North Korea at this point. So right now what you're seeing is a lot of consolidation of Kim Jong-un's power. It's not surprising that you see threatened nuclear tests. These are all shows of strength. Look at me, I'm Kim Jong-un. Yes, I'm young, but look how I can stand up to the global community. So all these expressions of strength, whether it's a missile test or a threatened nuclear test or launching missiles towards South Korean islands, these are all done to show a fearlessness that say, this guy can lead. So it's not a surprise you see any of this stuff going on, but the fact that he still has not been the kind of public persona that his father was, to me, shows that there's still very much going on behind the scenes. Either people are trying to train him as quickly as they can to be the leader, or that there are still other factions who think that this was not a good transition.
And speaking about transitions, as whole of Asia, in this 21st century, there are two major questions that came up. One is got to do with the uprising in the Middle East that has been happening for quite a while. And because it's got to do with oil and other resources, that will affect the markets, including Asia. Um, and secondly, the currency, itself, as far as the eurozone, the euro dollar, as well as the U.S. dollar. What happens if it deflates or defaults?
Right.
What's going to happen if, in your own perspective and your own expert opinion, if the uprisings, will to continue for probably either take a different turn, say, in a very negative manner or pessimistic view, and as well as the currency starts to default, what's going to happen to Asia? Would China, India, take up new opportunities? Would there be a new currency in the future?
In Asia?
Yes.
Okay. Two relatively separate questions. Let's go with the uprisings in the Middle East. What have the uprisings in the Middle East done in Asia? Right now, we don't have any threat. These were homegrown events. So there's no worry right now about the export of radicalism. People are worried that there's going to be a government in Egypt that might be the Muslim Brotherhood. That could be a problem. But nobody's worried about that being exported. So none of the countries in Asia right now are thinking, uh-oh, it's going to start, it's going to become a home base for Al-Qaeda and it's going to spread. That's not the concern. The concern you see in parts of Asia about the uprisings in the Middle East, and this actually goes back to Burma as well as China, is to watch how regimes that look like they would just last forever were undone by their own people. They really want to know how this happened, because there were times when people thought that Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, he was just going to be a lifelong dictator. I firmly think that the military in Burma saw the writing on the wall, saw how easy it would be, just with the right circumstances in play, to topple a military government. So do you want to go the way that Hosni Mubarak or that Muammar Gaddafi went? Well, no, that's not the best way to go. You're put on trial, you're thrown out, or in case of Muammar Gaddafi, you're killed. So what do? Well, you negotiate a graceful exit. That's why I think the military, though it wants to hold on to power, ultimately realizes that at some point they'll have to go. It's just a matter of when. China is a one-party state as well. China is now hypersensitive about any kind of dissent. If you've noticed, since the uprisings happened, since the Arab Spring has happened, even the smallest expressions of dissent, online, anywhere, have been dealt with immediately in China. They do not want discussions of democracy. They don't want expressions of self-determination in Tibet. They have moved very, very quickly on all of these, and I think it's because they're a little bit spooked by how easy it was for people in countries with very strong one-party or dictatorial governments to go. And so China's response has been to do that. But China also feels very alienated now because many of its former friends, these countries in the Arab world, are emerging as democracies. And that also creates this idea that democracy really is what people want. And that has, China has always been very afraid of being surrounded by Asian democracies. It's got Mongolia to the north, which became, an Asian democracy. It's got Southeast Asia to the south, Taiwan, democracy, Japan, democracy. So it's always been very afraid of being kind of the only country left that has its peculiar form of government. And so it's reacting to the Arab uprisings, I would say, nervously. Other countries in Asia simply are looking to see how this happens. Since ASEAN has already made really a concerted effort towards democracy. With the new charter for ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in 2007, there's an implicit step towards democracy in Southeast Asia, that ultimately governments that serve their people and allow for civil society are in the best interest of those countries and Southeast Asia. So, standing in Southeast Asia and looking at the Arab Spring, what are you looking at? You're not saying, uh-oh, they're becoming democracies. You're looking to see what worked and what didn't. Learn from those lessons so that if there are similar transitions here in Southeast Asia, they don't go that way. They don't make the same mistakes, or they can capitalize on the things that do work well. So it had a global effect, but watching Southeast Asia go through these democratic transitions in places like Burma, or as I said, possibly Vietnam, Laos, who knows? They're all looking to see, well, let's see how this turns out.
And about the currency,
right?
Yes. What happens if the U.S. and the eurozone takes its own turn for the worse? And how would China, India, two of the big mega ASEAN countries of the world that seem to be seen as a next so-called economic powerhouse,
Right.
and what will happen to Japan? Because there's a lot of predictions that Japan may go down, and that will take turn for the
Yes.
worse as well. Could you give us your own expert opinion on that?
Sure, I will. It's interesting to watch how these currency zones are falling apart. I've been to meetings from time to time when there were some people, say in ASEAN, or some people associated with Southeast Asia, who would say, at some point, one currency would be great. Like kind of like a euro for Southeast Asia. Those discussions don't take place anymore after watching what happened with the euro. The euro is in serious trouble, and whether the whole eurozone just kind of disappears as an interesting experiment in history, or whether it just shrinks down and core countries stick to the eurozone, we don't know yet. But everybody knows it's in trouble, and it's in trouble because you just had so many different economies trying to use the same currency, and it has become unworkable. The dollar, of course, is kind of its own currency. So the question is, what arguments can be made for the dollar? Well, probably the strongest argument for the dollar is the fact that even though the dollar is going through its own problems right now, is that it does remain still the most desirable currency. And of course there's always gold, but it does remain the most desirable currency. People often talk about, and China's done this, China has said, look, the dollar is not really usable, how about the yuan, how about Chinese currency? But the problem is that Chinese currency has always been politically valued, not economically valued. China has always controlled the value of its own currency in ways that are good for China, not for other countries. And other countries know this. So nobody wants to sink their efforts into a currency that is politically controlled as opposed to economically controlled. So what does that leave in Asia? It leaves the yen. Okay. The Korean won, for instance, is not yet the global currency. Korea wants it to be, but the Japanese yen is still, for many, a safe bet. So that means that countries do have an interest in watching what happens to the dollar and the yen, and also strengthening their ties to that, because that's always, if the dollar is weakening, maybe the yen is doing better. If the yen and the dollar are both there is Chinese currency. Now, you mentioned India as well. The Indian rupee is not going to be a global currency in the foreseeable future. It wants it to be. People want the Indian rupee to be, kind of the international recognition. But India's economy, in spite of its growth, does not have the kind of institutional stability that make people want to trust the rupee as the kind of alternative currency that India wants it to be. Maybe in 10 years and 20 years, things might be different. So right now, the only currencies you really have, the euro, everyone's nervous with, of course. You've got the dollar and the yen, which are still the preferred currencies. China's, as I said, is proposing the yuan as kind of an alternative, but people are very nervous about a currency that is so directly controlled by its own government as opposed to being controlled by the forces of the global economy. The fact that the dollar and the yen are as stable as they are, even though they float in world markets, is what makes them such attractive currencies in the first place. So I think the Eurozone is about the only thing that will drastically change. It'll be interesting if the Eurozone were to totally collapse, for instance, and you'd see the return of national currencies in Europe. That'll be a painful transition, but then it used to be the case that you could invest in pounds, you could invest in Swiss francs, and some of them are more stable than others. That would create new alternatives, but you can't get there until the Eurozone completely collapses, and a lot of people are very nervous about that happening. So it's an interesting time to look at financial markets right now.
Interesting. Well, perhaps one day we may have a one world currency.
Yeah, I'm not one of those people who thinks that would be the case, but I know there are some who think that might be a good idea.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Darren Zook.
My pleasure.
And Robin Steinberg, thank you for joining us here at the National Critics' Choice. Stay with Hyatt, and till we see you next time. So I'll edit that part. Very good.